Hello, good morning all. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. I have the pleasure today of sharing a little bit of our work at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I was previously at the University of Pennsylvania, but has been at Cedar for about 6, 7 months. So my talk today is regarding text mining for digital epidemiology. I would like to share a little bit of my points of view on this. Just point out before I start fully that my Twitter handle is right there, Graciela. Feel free to tweet questions. I tweeted about talking here earlier today. So if you want to, if you don't have a chance to put your questions, those of you joining virtually or those of you here in the room, feel free to just either comment on that thread and I can get back to you. I will appreciate all the questions. Be there. It's always good to hear from you. All right. So at Cedars, I lead the Health Language Processing Lab. I'm also vice chair for research and education. So I'm very, very interested in expanding the role that we can have in educating the new generations, in working with students. I've always been very keen in sharing the things that we learn with the academic community. And through shared tasks, we organize a lot of shared tasks in social media. I notice in many of the talks there's like tweets as support of the points that you want to make, and I also obviously saw the work on processing tweets. So I do a lot of work in social media. My work is supported by the National Library of Medicine, has been for 9 years or so. So what you see here is sort of tries to be an overview of the work that I've been doing in the lab. So basically, I see text mining as an entry point to higher levels of processing with artificial intelligence. So in medicine, there is a great need to find all this real world data that can help gain insights into what people think, insights into information that's out there but is not readily accessible automatically. So from different sources of real world data, we apply natural language processing methods in order to enable the higher order processing of artificial intelligence. I do work in digital epidemiology. Basically, these are studies, serious systematic studies in health that seek to use data that is not traditionally used for epidemiological studies. I don't know how familiar you are with all that, but epidemiology will look at what are potential determinants of health, distribution of factors that affect health events in specified populations, and it will analyze all this to try to gain insights into what could be better treatments, what is present, or the rate of infection. We're now coming through the biggest pandemic the world has seen in the last 100 years or so. So we learned a lot of lessons, and this kind of information, the information that's out there that's meant not for epidemiology but simply as communication, can be very, very valuable to get insights into health. So, so we require access to a large volume of data to advance analytics. It presents ethical challenges. That's like a whole other talk. Suffice it to say, everything that you see here was done on public data, on publicly available data. It is as such not human subjects research, but it does have some ethical implications. I try to mention a couple as we speak. So first of all, real world data. Real world data is pretty much anything and everything that's out there that is not a randomized controlled trial. That's the best definition that I found. It includes electronic health records, includes social media data, it includes sensors and wearable monitors, it includes also published data. So papers, the amount of information in papers that is meant for human consumption is even greater than you can imagine is on Twitter. particularly if you count every single paper that is being published every single day is loaded with information and links to other valuable data. Part of the work that we do involves enhancing the metadata of things like sequences deposited in GenBank or GSAID, where when, for example, all the COVID sequences are deposited there. So you'll see a little bit of that. So it's not just social media. Social media is just part of it. The FDA has called for real-world evidence, for this drive towards turning real-world data into real-world evidence that can be used in decisions about health and about what is the decisions by regulatory agencies in public health. So what is this path to real-world evidence? From the perspective that I come to it, which is through taking advantage of real-world data and natural language processing in particular, we start with extracting the data. So finding it probably could be one prior step, is get to the right data and then extract it so that it can be processed. So retrieval efforts are our first target, and they are often biased. The way we search for data, basically, is often biased and can impact the way down. I notice in many of the presentations, and you'll notice this too, people start with the process because we're like very excited about the algorithm that we use to process data. And we never stop long enough explaining what data we're processing. So how was it obtained? How was it annotated? Because anything you do with it will basically be determined by what you're feeding it. So I will invite you to always think about that. Think about what data is there, how did it get there, what were the searches used. And then, okay, so once you get that data, you start with the processes of extracting it, classification, extraction methods. Many of these methods are developed for a specific data set or a specific task. And many of these tasks are so unique that sometimes it's not generalizable. So, but we can make things generalizable. We can make things that can, models that can then apply to other tasks. So if we keep thinking about not only the task at hand, but the larger picture of how this task fits in other chain of events, we can make methods that can be more generally applicable. The state-of-the-art advances fast. I was just looking at transformers because they are mentioned as the architecture used in pretty much all the papers that we see now. 95% of them is my estimate, but because I haven't seen approaches that does not include that architecture. That architecture was proposed in 2017, following just a chain of events, a change of progress that has kept up all these years as well. So in natural language processing, we're constantly looking at new methods and new approaches, and the state-of-the-art advances faster than you can even publish a paper sometimes. So it is important to have very solid footing, validating your data, proving their utility, and then using the data, using the approaches, using the data that you extract. There's challenges along each of these steps. So there's challenges in validating. So gold standard annotation is scarce. I saw a lot, not just in this workshop, but in all the presentations I see, people rely on annotated data sets. Again, I'm always curious to see how the data set was annotated, because there are proper ways of doing it, and there are methods that need to be followed in order for it to make it rock solid. So when you use a data set, make sure you check how it was done. Check the annotation guidelines. Check what data is coming in to see if it makes sense for your processing. So validating requires investment and effort and time, and it is very, very important to, even if you're using a data set and then trying to adapt it to a new application, make sure you validate in the new one, in the new data that you are actually intending to process. So there's many, many steps in this path towards real-world evidence. Then the utility of this data, proving that it is useful. For that, that's the validation step. Many times evaluation is confused with validation. Evaluation is my algorithm working? Validation is it good for anything? So actually, validation is a very important step in order to then gain funding, to have publications of high impact, and so on. So, so it is always good to keep an eye out and see how you can actually use the methods, actually use the data, despite the challenges. You're gonna find things like no guidelines as to how to use your data that you just got out. How do you fit it in with the rest of the study? How do you fit in with traditional data sources? How does it complement data sources? Because in that is it lies its value. All right. So just quickly, electronic health record data. Probably, hopefully, all of us have heard of electronic health records and how they were pushed into the last 20 years so that all hospitals now keep their data in electronic health records. The intent was 20 years ago, 15 years ago or so, was to make it so data for health that is collected routinely can be or could be applied to other questions. So secondary use of data was a big term back then. Yet, despite all the effort, a lot of millions of dollars spent on this, 70 to 80% of electronic health record data, actionable data, is ignored. It's just bypassed because it's too hard to get. In my own study, I tried to figure out the answer to what percentage of the studies that use EHR data use all this unstructured portion, all this rich source of data. And my number came out to be 0.5. I'll show you a little bit of how we did that. It's in, the details are in that paper. It's in the Annual Review of Biomedical Data Science Journal. We were looking at how do studies that claim that there are sex-specific differences in health outcomes, how the studies were done. That's basically the initial question for this research. So we got searches going. We got about 67,000 articles in Medline that matched our initial search terms that had to do with sex-related terms, disparities or differences terms, and so on. So just with that, we got 67,000 articles. However, when we add terms that speak about machine learning, AI, NLP, is a long set of keywords for that, the number was only 469. That indicates that that less than 1%, so it is actually a little bit over half a percentage point, use these advanced methods. And this is a proxy for when you use unstructured data. Because short of going by hand through all of these electronic health records, which is a very limited scope for a study, you cannot really go manually through thousands of them. Usually studies do like 50 to 100 records checked by hand. So that's the limit of human processing because of cost and other problems. If you want to go to anything beyond around those numbers, you need some sort of method to handle it. So that's why the terms for machine learning, AI, and NLP are very good proxies to understand when unstructured data is used. So less than 1%. So you might be wondering, is like, why will we use it? Why will we use all those notes that the doctors type in our records instead of just the codes, the codes that identify the specific diagnosis or the codes that identify specific measures? We are by nature, very quantitative people, so we're sort of like suspicious about all these other things that are not quantitative. So ICD-9 codes are routinely used to make searches. So in this study, this is not my paper. This is a separate study that I use as an example of what can be found. Why should we use unstructured data? They were looking to assess whether hypoglycemic events happen in type 2 diabetes patients, or how often they happen. So they got their data set together of type 2 diabetes patients, and then they found how many of these events were reported. And they found, just to give you an idea, these numbers, look at the blue column only. Don't worry about the orange or the yellow. The blue column is the total number of events of all kinds, severe or mild. All of them all added together is 46,000. So they found 46,000, which is about 10 to 12% of their the total number of patients, about 10 to 12% experience a hypoglycemic event. Then when they use NLP, they found that really there was evidence of about 93,000 of them. So that's twice as many. So 20 to 24% instead of 12%. And even more interesting, when you combine the two, you arrive at 119,000, which is about 30% of the patients or so. It stands to reason, even if you're not a doctor, an MD, that you will have different actions if only 10% of your patients suffer of something compared to 30% of them. So 3 times as many. So we are actually, by not using the unstructured data, we're reaching the wrong conclusions in our studies. So it's not only, oh, well, you're not using the data. It's like you are reaching the wrong conclusions by omitting all of that information that's out there. So if you imagine like that, there's 67,000 papers, each of which, on average, will cost about, I don't know, $100,000 or more, just judging by funding sources, that miss the mark just because they're not using the right methods. Another source of real-world data, social media data, is also grossly underutilized. Aside from all these examples that we see in screens with like people tweeting stuff and all the stuff we read, it is not officially used at this point by any regulatory agency. There is no systematic approach to using social media data, or that at least that we know of. It has been used to inform other studies. And it's very funny that it is mentioned in some papers saying we checked social media and found some of the adverse effects that we were going to search for. And then here's our search terms. I don't know if any of you noticed, but that's brushing off a very important search strategy, because the social media search strategy is rarely specified. So we don't know what that person did with social media. And they just jumped at applying it to a study. And like a systematic review, for example. And so we're hoping to change that little by little. The very first hint at social media being used by regulatory agencies came with COVID. So I actually found this in the FDA website. Fraudulent COVID-19 products were being monitored. And the FDA says that the agency will continue to monitor social media and online marketplaces promoting and selling fraudulent COVID-19 products. So they are using it. They just don't tell me how. So I'm still wondering. I taught a class at the FDA this past a couple months ago, and it was on epidemiology. And I was talking to them about digital epidemiology and so on. So I think that it is going in that direction, that now all of these methods will start to be used formally and systematically in order to incorporate data, real-world data, into our studies. So social media. We have to stop thinking of social media as just like whatever a platform you're using, be it Reddit or Twitter. Social media is people. There's people behind it. Despite all these advertisements about bots being like the dominant force and this and that, there's many, many ways where you can rule out bots, you rule out institutional accounts, and you can get at people. Personal accounts are important to detect. Again, a whole other talk on that. But I wanted to show you this Twitter screenshot, but make sure that you keep thinking about the people behind rather than just the screen. So here we see an explanation about a diagnosis. So I've been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety. It includes therapy for 2 months, some of the inner feelings of this user, and it gives such a complete picture in such a short message. And then with it usually comes what I call the Me Too effect, is people just simply joining and sharing similar experiences with this person that shared the first one. Interestingly enough, in this single screenshot, not manipulated at all, we see a real threat, or what we consider for the person that talk about misinformation. That's a personal um, story that seems real, followed by a typical I wouldn't even call it misinformation. It's a joke, right? It's just a funny tweet that in natural language processing we have to deal with. So yes, as you can imagine, there are classifiers that can tell me the difference between the fifiphobia tweet and the one about obsessive compulsive disorder. So those are some of the challenges that we did. We developed methods, deep ADE minor, for adverse event detection. So this is people tweeting about their medications and adverse events. We have the state-of-the-art performing system for the full pipeline and for the individual tasks. Is not the same. There's many papers on classification. There's many papers on name entity recognition. Very few on normalization, where you get the term and then normalize it to a specific medical term in a vocabulary such as MEDRA, which is what we use, and then the full pipeline. That's very, very important as well to remember. When we do these kinds of processing, many times we focus so much in one task that we forget that there should be tasks before that that feed it to make it realistic. So I'm a proponent of realistic balances in data rather than artificially balanced data for training or methods. Because when you artificially balance the data, even though you might think that it is fine for the training set, but not for the test set. Have your test sets be as natural as you will find them, or if anything, just subject to simple filters that are reproducible. So reproducibility in our machine learning methods, in our AI methods, is very, very important, and it's missed many times. So how you construct your training set, how you construct your test set is very, very important to keep this sense of systematic approaches to validating all of this. So there's shared tasks. We share the data as well. If any of you are intrigued, you can compete against our systems. We always open that up. It's in Coda Lab. If you're curious, we do SMM4H is the name of our workshop. It runs every year at the ACL conference, a family of conferences. And we release about 6 or 7 shared tasks and annotated data sets every year. And it has been running for 8 years now, 7 years, going into the 8. What is found? Remember how I told you in the electronic health records that it is worth it because there's information there that we're missing? Same thing with social media. If we're looking at, like, you might be wondering, like, why in the world would I look at social media to see if there's anything new about statins? This is a cholesterol-lowering drug that is used by a good portion of the population. Like, and when I say good, it's about, in England, for example, everybody is put on statins at age 55, I believe. In the US, it's estimated that 25 to 30% of people that after an age of 40 or so are on statins, but it can be higher. Anyway, it's very widely used. So is there anything new that social media is going to tell us? And we basically started with an open question for this research. It ran for about 6 months. It is published in JAMA Network Open, which is a very good journal. And basically what we started with is, what do people talk about when they talk about statins on Twitter? And we went down from there. So, or up from there, I guess. so we had a qualitative study. This was enabled by NLP. This was not done automatically, which is a thing we're finding over and over in digital epidemiology. We start with humans. We use the data that they annotate to develop the systems that then enable humans to make really much better analysis or look at a smaller data set for analysis and discovering things. So what we discovered, just to cut to the chase, is this belief that people that are on statins think of it as sort of a license to eat. So as long as they're in statins, they're protected, they can eat whatever they want. So it's like, instead of seeing it as an adjuvant to your health, where you need to make changes to your diet and make changes to your exercise routine in order to lower your cholesterol and eat healthy and so on, it's like, well, now I'm on drugs, so I'll be fine. Like the pill will, the little pill will take care of lowering my cholesterol. I don't need to do anything else. So that was evident through the analysis, where this belief directly impacted the actions of the user. So that was not in any of the traditional studies. Reason being that most studies don't ask why people don't take or what they think. They just ask whatever they want to ask, and people answer whatever they want to answer, because, by the way, many times it's not the truth. And then so surveys give us biased data. So this is why it's important to go back to the sources and see how people are openly talking about it, about their medications, about their health, about the diseases, and taking that into account. We have active neural networks detecting mentions of changes to medication. So why do people change their treatments? And they don't tell their doctors. It's a very, very, very big problem. And the reasons for it are also posted, often, actually. So we have that. We found that most of the time they have experienced an adverse drug reaction, but also many times they stop their medications just for the fear of an adverse reaction, because a friend or somebody in social media said that they experienced something, and that gives enough, the fear is big enough to make them alter their own treatments, even if they haven't experienced the adverse effect. Just a funny thing there is, if you have ever filled up any of those questionnaires in your doctor's office, sometimes they ask you about if you took it or didn't take it. They often don't ask why or why not you take your medication. And the other thing they don't ask is if they ask about experiencing an adverse effect. Have you experienced any of these adverse effects? And you might say no, right? They never ask if you're afraid of these adverse effects. And so anyway, so this information hiding and obscured, I guess, by some of the traditional methods. This percentage is different than what is published. The 20% that we found of people using, having an adverse effect, experience or fear of an adverse effect be the reason for changing their treatment, that number is different than what is published in other sources. So now we have to like kind of correlate everything. And I know I have 5 minutes. So a whole big study on pregnancy that we did in social media is also of interest. In this one, we find users that experience a condition, in this case is pregnancy, and we have developed the methods little by little. This has been running for 4 or 5 years now, little by little, to be able to analyze the information that comes from this cohort. So in this case, we look at outcomes, we look at medications taken during pregnancy. So many studies that can be run with this information. We publish a paper of this one is in Nature Digital Medicine. So again, high impact journals are looking at some of the stuff that we're doing and publishing it. I mean, among others, there's like many papers published on this particular study. We did look at COVID vaccine in pregnancy. And finally, to wrap up, published data is also underutilized. Here, what I wanted to point out is that in our scientific method, we have a publication first view, meaning you do your work, you publish a paper, and then you wait for people to read your paper. You might tweet about it or like tell to your friends about it, present at conferences about them, but then basically it's a passive process. This has been shown to be insufficient for things like COVID. The rate of papers published was much higher than could be processed. And expecting scientists that want to make advances to look at a paper first in order to find sequences that go with that paper is just a very big impediment to large-scale studies. So if you just step away from that thought for a second, so imagine there's like millions of sequences of samples from patients put into databases with valuable information that should go with them missing. So what was the ethnicity or race of this patient, the age, the outcome, severity of COVID, all of that information is not in that sequence, it's those millions of sequences. It's in a paper somewhere. So we got funding from the NIH to correct this problem and enrich the data deposited in GenBank by extracting information from literature about these particular facts. So now I could, in theory, look at all Hispanic or samples coming from a Hispanic in the whole United States, for example, and then make analysis of that data from the sequence perspective rather than trying to collect all the papers that have published and that happen to have a subset of their sequences come from Hispanic patients or patients of Hispanic origin. So enriching this sequence metadata through NLP is another one of our big issues. This one is funded by the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, and it's an extension of our prior funded work on looking at geographic location extraction. Same idea. It's like sequences are there. They just tell us they was collected in China, which is kind of big. And then in the paper, you find out that it's Wuhan rather than just China. So it is not in the sequence. If you go look up the sequence in GSAID, it doesn't say Wuhan, China. You have to go look at the paper to find it. So information is missing and underutilized in all of these sources. With this, I'm going to wrap up. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable fair data and methods is important also to move forward from real-world data to real-world evidence. We have to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I will add another R there to reproducible, but at least for methods. So natural language processing is but a tool that helps us utilize machine learning, artificial intelligence to actually derive from real-world data, real-world evidence. And with that, I conclude. I put my contact there so that you can reach out. And I think we might have like one or two questions. There's no vote for like best keynote?
We'll do it next time.
Oh.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. In this age of uncertainty of Twitter, I mean, would you mind elaborating what would happen with all of these studies that rely on Twitter, if Twitter were to, you need to pay for it, if it were to disappear? Are there other media outlets that you could rely on to do comparable studies?
Yes, all of our papers have some of that, by the way. How we have validated varies. The studies are not done, as I said, automatically. The data is found automatically. And then the studies are done by annotation, so that's qualitative research. So mixed methods analysis is a common way. So the NLP comes to serve as a way to get that. Yes, there are some studies that you could potentially run that just basically give you a trend or inform you about a trend. But the actual digital epidemiology studies require some steps beyond that and usually include just analysis, data analysis, just the regular data. How does it compare to others? Well, you can do data triangulation. We do comparison to findings in systematic reviews, comparison to findings in other databases, and so on. And there's going to be differences, like in the rate of reports of adverse reactions, for example. The way that is reported right now to the FDA is through a clinician putting in a report. Patients can as well report, but that's not the main source. It's usually a clinician or a healthcare provider. But in order for that to happen, what has to go through the mind of the doctor is, oh, this is rare enough or serious enough that I need to go report it. There's no absolute guidelines about what needs to be reported and what not, but typically it's the most serious effects. But the things that make people change their treatment are not that serious. They're things like dizziness, because they cannot work, they cannot drive. Like, what are you gonna do? You need to get rid of that in order to function. So that's that disconnect. The official sources will tell you something, and the fact that we find them in social media through systematic analysis doesn't mean that this is not true just because it's not in some of the traditional sources. It's just different. That's why we call it complementary, and that's where we have to think how the data, what data comes from where, and how do we process it in order to make analysis and say, oh, it's coming directly from people saying they changed their medication because it made it so easy they couldn't go to work. That strikes like truth. If you disconnect it from that and just think about the machine learning or the AI or whatever it is that you use, you start doubting it, right? Like, well, it could be wrong. But once you go back and forth and try to understand where it comes from and how it is processed, then you can see that it is just as reliable or even more than some of the surveys. A funny thing, Sue Golder, which is a collaborator at the University of York that have been working with us for 6-7 years now, she does systematic reviews. She's the person that has done more surveys that I know, and she does it for Cochrane, which, if you know about it, is a really big name in all of these studies. She says that they get the same people answering the surveys, and that people answer in the easiest way possible. That is, if you click yes, and then 5 questions come up, you go back and change it to no, just to get through the thing. People have done it. Everybody has done that, just because it's too hard. And so that's the information that we're using as a gold standard. I think we need to rethink the whole thing, and what's true and what's not requires further study. So the best we can hope for is that we get enough flags raised around areas of interest, like adherence and why are people not doing the treatments. The World Health Organization stated that one of the greatest changes that can happen in human health is just anything that will change adherence, and that people will actually take their treatments the way they are.
A very quick question.
Sure.
So all of this, each kind of source of data induce some bias. How do you try to come up to get an unbiased estimation about that?
All right. So you can tackle bias. The very first step is just think about it. It's like, where can bias sneak in? So it could be in your collection of data. It could be Twitter has some known demographics, for example. So you take that into account. And in your collection, you try to either balance out by finding out. So we have methods to derive the demographic of Twitter users directly by self-expression. So I always favor when people tell me their age, or tell me instead of trying to guess it by the way they talk. All of the ones I've tried that guess my age and my gender are off, always, because like I don't fit the mold of whatever training data they had. So I don't do that. So in our methods, we get it specifically from the user's profile or from the tweets, and we're able to derive age and gender and race with different levels of precision and so on. But when we really want to get a look at a specific demographic, then we simply eliminate everything else. So if you want to rebalance, you can rebalance your data set. If I wasn't able to get the age of some user, then I just don't use the user. See what I mean? I have enough data that I can like just focus in the ones and the conditions that I want to. So I can rebalance my data sets for analysis either, so that you can do it at the end of it when you analyze with those variables and confounders, taking into account variables and confounders, or you can eliminate it up front. So for example, in pregnancy, we eliminated painfully about 80% of our database because we couldn't tell the exact beginning and end of pregnancy time frame. But that still left us 150,000 users where we have the beginning and end of pregnancy period. So we have the tweets during pregnancy and so on. So having set knowledge helps a lot in these studies and helps in addressing biases. All right, thank you.